I'm going to move my computer closer. Get into here. I'm like, we'll just ask everybody.
So what Peter, all in favor? Second item is discussing marijuana cultivation from our last meeting.
So the first one was on I think I noted when there was new standards in the kind of license that we did cover some of the investigation, performance standards. And the other was, I think, the yeah, they haven't found a real yeah. So that's where this piece of a marijuana cultivation facility may only occur within a fully enclosed permanent structure. This use is not allowed in temporary or accessory type structures such as houses, greenhouse, pension fund truck. This area within the structure dedicated to cultivation activities is fully enclosed and meets all applicable performance standards set forth in the marijuana establishment licensing ordinance. Is that where the city was?
I think so.
Right. Okay. Here, the setbacks and so I think there was healthy discussion last meeting on is it 50 feet, is it 100 feet? You know, what's the right establishment? And I'm not sure that we came to a complete resolution on that. I think that's where we were figuring out our energy for this topic at the last meeting. I think what Jay wound up recommending was sticking with the 50 feet marijuana cultivation facility only allowed in the lot area of 2 acres or more, and a minimum setback of 8 acres containing marijuana cultivation is probably 50 feet from the lot. And that was what we did with the utility solar standard. So, and that's what it is. We in industrial areas in their application to our so that is a question for us. Are we good with 50 feet or?
The only reason why the question is, I don't know why, but I thought residential areas
The other thing too, is, discussing what I'm talking it's fully about odor mitigation. It's also about setbacks, especially being in setbacks, limit the number of properties. Which is why I think it was great to drop $100. Which I'm comfortable with. Yeah, it is as much about limiting the potential number of lots in the RM that could. That was not.
And I do remember that the property owner who was interested in doing that, well, did not have an issue with
Yeah.
it.
Because if that came up.
So,
You can allow factors 50, double it. Very. And I'm a voting member, but I'm sure. A little bit of a higher standard for that, but I agree with James' point in the memo that it's something, it's negligible when it comes to it.
more of a feel good.
Yeah, exactly. But again,
Very big.
Of any type. Marijuana, so, regulations, in all the marijuana. How about that?
Yeah, and I think that points roll pretty well with what we experienced when we do the overall marijuana. So I think, you know, the setbacks, the concerns about the number of lots, the size of the lots, plus, you know, the odor was the big one that we talked about. I think that like we look at what James proposed here, what you're suggesting, sounds pretty fine with that. Yeah.
Is everybody in general agreement?
Yeah, I guess I have a question, whether anything else can be within 100 feet, when I'm thinking about security. So, is it 100 feet, then the security fence, and then the building, or is it building 100 feet and security measure? Maybe closer to the border.
And to that point, I suggested that it was a question that got go to the larger.
Well, it doesn't. Structure.
Right.
Containing marijuana.
Okay.
Right. I don't think, during the building.
In ordinance, the establishment ordinance, that's a very specific, criteria for security.
Yeah. So my only point is, whether you're gonna, however, it's technically written, whether it's from the building or the fence structure or the property, that we gotta go with the larger number, so there are fewer of these rather than more. That's my. So, yeah.
And I just don't know what it was, you know, the sign. Because it's pushing one, and all of a sudden, well, what is it? Certainly after.
We'll have figured it out, but what do you want? For us to find a better,
You know, if I'm on right, and my setback is 50 feet, that setback is 50 feet. It's not too offensive. Consistency. And so my inclination would be more the 100-foot setback.
The person may want to put a fence near the road to protect the entire property and not just a building, let's
Or the
say,
property line.
or their property
Typically
line.
where it would go.
Yeah, I mean, 2 feet or whatever that regulation is, but I think that if we have an ordinance, it should be to the building itself and not toward a fence or anything
The
else.
key here is marijuana cultivation. The structure containing.
Right.
The structure, yeah,
My only
But-
question for consistency's sake is, security fences are a bit more engineered than the fence that I have running between my property and my neighbor's property. And I'm guessing we have other security fences in town that might be a part of the industrial district. So do we have an analogy in the industrial district where the fence is considered, where the boundary is? And if not, then I think you're right. From a consistency perspective, we should adopt the same handling of a fence here as we would other fences. So I'm just wondering if there's an analogy in the industrial zone that we already have solved this issue.
Are there different criteria for these two kinds of fences?
In the industrial zone, basically, you can, for fence, basically you can go up to the property line. What we have is basically a design standard that says a chain link fence is allowed in the industrial zone as long as the standard we usually hold them to is that it's coated in plastic. In other words, it's not a gray, ugly chain link fence. It's a nicer chain link fence, more visually pleasing.
And what about the height? I mean, when I think of security, I think of height, and I think of
It's really not,
wire.
I can't think of any standards, Robin. Yeah, I can't think of any standards on height.
So
Security is security, depending on
Yeah,
what the building is and everything else.
I'm just checking the security requirements in the licensing.
Sometimes it's around utility locations, we have that. And a lot of times the security fence is in place
No.
Okay.
around what needs to be secured. And the owner or the developer determines kind of what the outline is going to be and the distance from the building as whatever is necessary to secure the property.
So it's probably tighter to the building. than
It's probably tighter to
Yeah.
the building, but for something like marijuana facility, they might want severe limitation of access.
And are security fences allowed in standard rural farm? Is there a height restriction to the fences that doesn't exist?
Keep your livestock.
Yeah, it's nothing
Yeah.
it's nothing that's come before us that I can remember, so I really can't say. I've not researched that because we usually don't face that, and usually if I'm trying to think of other times, it's usually, certainly in the residential zone, it's a cedar fence, split cedar,
Final.
picket, something like that, but its purpose in a non-industrial zone is to say, this is where the property is,
Right,
or be pretty, rather than security.
I understand what Marvin is saying, and I think that my thought process is twofold. One is that the medical marijuana cultivation rules and the cultivation rules are going to be fairly robust as to what type of security and protection you have to have, and if they're not there, then it's your finance will require it. Second, very few facilities that I know of, I do a lot of like municipal security fencing, that type of thing, you really aren't really relying on the razor wire on top anymore. It's the low cost of video technology now that's motion censored, that everybody, as soon as there's motion, it comes up on your phone that there's action out there and you can see who it is and it starts recording, and it's fairly inexpensive, and I would imagine that most of them would have that. I get that if somebody wants to breach it, they'll get in, but there you have it on video.
I'm not really talking about how somebody's going to get in or not, at least I'm thinking about what it looks like, what the relationship is to what's allowed now versus what this will entail, and whether or not you need to place being arbitrary, I don't know. Sounds as though this hasn't come before the planning board.
I just can't think of a case, so, and I didn't research the
So just
design.
a couple of clarifications. So in the absence of any discussion of fencing or anything like that, it's going to fall to whatever the underlying zone, which is, I think, what Rachel described. So I've gone back to the establishing
Sorry.
Right, bye. He gets a good send off. Yes. So I've gone back to the establishing the licensing requirements, which does have a section on security. So surveillance cameras installed that monitor 7 days a week with 30-day storage has to monitor both entrances and along the interior and exterior of the premises. Door and window combination video and motion detector intrusion systems with audible alarm. Locking safe or locked room permanently affixed to the premises that is suitable for the storage of marijuana products, cash essentially, and exterior lighting, and deadbolt locks on all exterior doors and other exterior access points. So it does not reference fencing. So therefore, any fencing,
I think we can cut this discussion
Yeah.
short. The definition of structure under the ordinance specifically excludes boundary walls and fences.
Mhm.
So this is an academic discussion, but
well, unless they wanted to
Increase
add
the-
something.
But
Yeah,
fence isn't subject to setbacks.
Right.
Because it's not a structure.
Okay.
Putting aside the fact
Ah.
that Jay's language describes this
Yes.
particular structure as one that contains marijuana. So if it isn't a marijuana structure, it wouldn't be subject to this anyway.
And
But fences are
surveillance-
excluded.
Surveillance may change over time, as Robin said too, just the whole way we do security. So containing this to structure leaves them decisions about security.
The question is, do you put the setback further back because of a different kind of fence that the neighbors are not considering at this juncture? That
well, I think,
the
correct me if I'm
fence can
wrong.
go anywhere,
Yeah.
so we're not really talking about fencing, right?
yeah, so I think it would have to be something different and maybe, and the question is that for the zoning ordinance or does that belong in the security? Could be either, but if what you're talking about is essentially not having an ugly fence in some respects.
We have standards for that already, and although they don't specifically say no ugly fences.
Right. I was simplifying.
Yeah.
I was doing the economic development
Okay.
summary.
Yeah.
No ugly fences. So where do we stand? How's everybody feeling?
So the setback moves from 50 to 100 and we leave it alone.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it does, and if I agree with that. I think we should be consistent with how we handle a fence for this as we would handle other things. Sounds like we don't handle it in the industrial zone or something like that. So, okay, 100 feet, we're good.
To the building.
Yeah.
To the building.
One very minor comment, plural lines. Lines rather than lot lines.
Ah, yes. Thank you. Okay, and then on permitting, I think where Jay was coming from on this particular issue is trying to give a little bit more focus on, each applicant's particular situation. And that's why he was suggesting, if we put it as a special exception use, then it goes to the ZBA, and I know you're concerned about having gray areas.
You're kicking it to the ZBA.
Yes,
Exactly. Yeah.
but at least that does give an extra level of, you get to look at what is the situation here? What are the neighbors doing? How it relates to, you can speak better about.
Having
about what
sat
you're
in
doing.
a 4-hour ZBA meeting on Wednesday night to talk about 2 issues, one of which was Higgins Beach. I'm relishing the ZBA talking about marijuana issues. On the
Sarcasm.
second Wednesday of every month. Yeah, exactly. Had-
Watch it on Zoom with popcorn. and
Yeah.
I may
I'll come
start using
over.
marijuana as a result of the ZBA getting this as part of its remit.
Yeah, no laughing, because then it goes to the planning board, right?
So I guess my concern on this one is, like I said, I'm not sure the ZBA is ideally suited for this, but it's what we have. I do think we need an extra level of review so that this is not just a permitted use. I think it needs to have some sort of a review process. I would prefer it, again, I've said this before, I prefer it to stay within the town council as part of an overlay zoning request, but if the town council saying, no, we want to kick it to the ZBA, then, okay, fair enough, it is what it
Yeah,
is.
and I think and I don't want to put words in the council's mouth, but I think what the question to us was, if they choose to go the zoning route, what would it look like in a zoning ordinance? I don't know that that decision has been made that, no, we're definitely not doing a contract zone. I think the question is, tell us the best scenario in zoning.
And my suggestion would be to add whether you're gonna ask the planning board for an advisory opinion at some point.
Yeah,
Before it,
no, not all special exceptions require it.
yeah, so, just, that's a decision that needs to be made.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the standard there now is this community benefit, right? It's very broad. Or context, so.
And
Changes.
And to the- I was gonna say, and that's at least, if it was broad, at least it's within the purview of the town council.
It belongs there. no
Yeah.
question.
And if we're gonna push it as a special exception, I just like as much detail, to your point, what's the role of the planning board? What are the facts and circumstances to be understood, like we would for any yard size area? So, because again, this is not a traditional zoning board question, so the more guidance that we can get, the more specificity we have.
I have a question. And it's sort of the person off the street type of approach. My understanding is about things like this, if the abutting property owner or owners object to this kind of application, they have a lot of influence. Is that true in this case?
I'll say from experience, certainly
Would it be true?
the abutters, especially for special exception uses, we put a lot of weight for whether the abutters have said anything. In many cases, they don't. And if they have said anything, where the preponderance of opinion goes. So that does make a big difference for special exception approvals today.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason to kick it, because you can consider that, because don't have the language in front of me, but it allows them to take into consideration what's happening around the proposed use and how it fits in.
Yeah, I think you have to be sensitive to the abutting property owners. And I think whatever provides that, we should adopt.
Okay. So it sounds like we're good with the special exception. We just want to make sure that in this one, it includes a planning board comment.
It
I mean,
specifies.
if you want it,
If you
yeah,
want it, exactly.
specify and when.
Okay,
And again, if and for the town to enumerate the specific areas to be considered and voted upon by the ZBA would be a question.
And then that's what the planning board would also take a
Yeah, exactly.
look at, yeah.
So if you look at the most classes of exemption or of variances that we approve have a 5 to 8 question worksheet that describes specifically what the ZBA is meant to ask of the applicants and to review and find in fact from the applicants. So having a guide like that from the town council for us to work out would be appreciated.
okay, but isn't that stipulated in the special exception part of the CBA, like what you guys can consider?
Various special exceptions though have different requirements. So that's what I'm saying. We just
Okay.
probably need a specific one for this one.
I like the addition of ferry.
Okay, so, and yeah, probably it does need to be there and not in the establishing licensing ordinance.
Yeah, the ZBA is gonna do it, it
Yeah.
needs to be within the zoning ordinance.
Okay. So that would, well, let's keep going and we'll see if there's anything else that needs to come back to you. Okay, so for agricultural standards, during the May deliberation, we touched on it quickly, but I'm not sure that, and we didn't have any other issues being raised. So the standard right now, or the language is any building or structure activity related to the planting, propagation, growing, harvesting, or cultivation of marijuana must be operated and maintained in accordance with the latest edition of the Maine Department of Agriculture's, I should really put my glasses on. So help, agriculture's manual of best management practices for Maine agriculture.
Is that the same as it is for other farming activity?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, and so all of those pieces are now in this, here's section 9 with performance standards on marijuana cultivation facility in the RF and RFM districts. And let's remember, we're talking cultivation only, not manufacturing, not testing, just cultivation. And so these are the 4 standards that we just agreed to. So the addition to this is really articulating those standards that the ZBA would look at under special exceptions.
And then this is more just a question about the Pearson's original request. They just wanted a cultivation facility. They were not looking for.
I don't think so.
Correct. Their
Got it.
goal was to farm.
Got it. Okay.
Gross.
Just, I didn't remember. So.
Yeah. Okay, and then obviously subject to performance standards, and that's the piece that goes into each of the districts under special exceptions. So other than this one additional piece, we're good with the language.
50 to 100.
Right.
Yeah.
Correct. Oh, right. Sorry. Yes, I have that marked.
Lines.
Yes.
And
Line
one other-
50 to 100 and lines.
One other
Actually, I should do
technical
it on
comment.
here too.
I don't know how this works when ordinance provisions get put in, but we should capitalize marijuana cultivation facility because it is a defined term under the ordinance.
That's an excellent point.
That's probably a ordinance consistency
Yep.
issue more than anything else, but
An MCF.
MCF,
Because we need
MCF,
another acronym. Exactly.
MMF
exactly.
and MTF. 3 different
Excellent.
types of things.
Okay, so, there's some excellent discussion. It feels like we got to a comfortable place for everyone.
Good work, everybody.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, do we have anybody that's members that are on, I guess not, because we're all here.
We do. We certainly can take comment if Allison, I don't know if Allison wanted to, we don't have comment built into this until the end,
Yeah,
but if there's no reason we couldn't do it now, if certainly that's what she wanted to do. She has not.
Okay.
Okay.
She has.
Oh, has.
okay. Anybody object to listening to her?
No.
Okay.
Good morning, can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We can, yeah,
Good,
vaguely.
wonderful. Wonderful, thank you very much. And I didn't hear the very beginning of the conversation because the audio was garbled. But based on the most of the conversation, I would say I do have a couple of comments. And first of all, I would like to reiterate the fact that the town is revisiting this after 2 years where it was settled that marijuana would not be allowed to be cultivated in rural farmland for the benefit of one property owner. And I don't, I understand where Mr. Pearson is coming from, but it seems to me that the rest of the town shouldn't be subjected to something it has already expressed it's not interested in for the benefit of one property owner. I do thank the committee for the special exemption conversation, and I'll have to bone up on that. And I wanted to say to Mr. Freilinger, and I hope I got your name right this time,
Yeah, thank you, Allison.
that Higgins Beach will be there. We will be there. A couple of other points I wanted to make was that I believe, and I haven't read it recently, in the current marijuana zoning, cultivation is bundled into cultivation and related manufacturing. So if this is something that moves forward, I think that needs to be looked at and perhaps revisited, because I think we also established when we were talking about this a couple of years ago, that there are, that there are dangers to related manufacturing, and certainly something that doesn't belong in a residential neighborhood. And lastly, I'll just say that, odor remains an issue. And even though we've moved this not to a hoop house, but to a permanent structure, I would point to Snow Cannery and the issues that they have had down there and what the neighbors have had to deal with. Security is still a concern. And with fencing, I would certainly think something that's aesthetically pleasing in a residential neighborhood would not be the way to go. And chain link fences certainly would not be consistent with the aesthetic here. And then the last thing I would like to add is when the original marijuana ordinance was in front of the planning board, I believe Ms. Hendrickson had pointed out or mentioned that originally what I call the Spurwing Black Point Road corridor, or not originally, but 20 years ago, was zoned as rural residential. So if we're not looking at an overlay for where marijuana cultivation might be appropriate, perhaps part and parcel to allowing this, we consider rezoning this area back to what it was, because we have, and we are even more residential with the Piper Shores contract zone that, got approved and is wonderful. I mean, they're doing a great job, and I think it's going to, look and be terrific. But, we now also allow commercial utility scale solar panels down here. And it's kind of a, rural farmland becomes a catch-all for economic development. And as I've said many times, economic development does not equal quality of life. So I thank you all very much. And, I'll look forward to taking this up at ordinance.
Thank you, Allison.
So I do want to just, I hope, a couple of the items. One, this is cultivation only, not manufacturing. They're defined separately in the enabling legislation. So this is cultivation only, manufacturing and cultivation have two different definitions. And it does not allow testing either. And again, a clarification, our charge by the council was to do this as an ordinance. That doesn't mean that that's what I do this as part of the zoning ordinance. That doesn't mean that's going to be their choice. They may indeed go back to or choose a contract zone, but you fulfilled your duty to the council, which is to advise them if they wanted to do zoning, what would it look like? So I just want to make sure that we know neither of those two issues have been settled. Okay, I think we're done with that topic.
So yeah, we're not voting, but we're making a recommendation to the council.
Correct.
Right, with the notes.
Yes, we can certainly vote if we,
I think the consensus is what we've documented.
And I think we can tell being in the committee certainly here, or the council, that it reflects the unanimous consensus of the committee. We've had a really good discussion, it feels like. Yeah, that we're behind it.
Agreed.
And
Just on your point, though,
yes,
and this discussion based on this person's comments, we're not voting on whether this should or should not be adopted.
that's correct.
We are advising the council that should the council wish to consider, we have vetted language that we think addresses the issues.
Right.
We aren't voting.
Right,
to
we're not
approve.
recommending.
If we were to send a recommendation back that says we recommend that you not consider this, we would be shirking our responsibility. So and this comes up all the time in this committee.
Yeah.
We're a vetting on language committee. We're not a good or bad idea committee. So
Okay, so I will make these changes and pull the,
The final comment I have is, what the council's request to us was predicated on, which is this single person's request. And I still have questions with that. It seems to me that the council's request of us, again, I'm repeating myself, was predicated on something that didn't really warrant our consideration. And as far as the contract zone versus what they're asking us to consider, and we kicked that around in here. And I just want to make sure that I don't know what the committee's consensus is on that point, but it strikes me that I'm not 100% sure why we're considering this based on the fact of one person's request and avoidance of a contract zone. I understand that the council has its reasons, and with all due respect, I accept those reasons. I may not, just as one member, be in agreement with that approach, and I don't know if the council, excuse me.
I can respond to that. So, I mean, there's definitely this dynamic where we ask for input, and then there's an assumption that we're really in favor of doing this. So it's, so I think it's a fair point that one person has asked about this, and I'm kind of right down the road doing the work as if it's going to be approved by the council. And so it kind of, in a way, pretty direct way paves the path for this to get done and to be approved. So I mean, there's definitely that dynamic, and I don't know. I don't want to speak for the council. I can't say where we are right now. I think there's a general feeling that we want to get tighter with exceptions and exemptions in general with ordinances. So the only other thing I'd say with this is that if you haven't been to, this is sort of in the category for those who are interested and want to learn more, if you've never seen what a cultivation facility looks like, it's worth visiting, because what your image may be and what it actually is too. But for me, it was two different things. So you go in there and you'll probably learn more about it from movies and popular culture than you do from actually, seeing it real time. But the stuff that's at Snow Canyon Road, these are really sophisticated rooms with incredible ventilation facilities, power, lighting, water. I mean, it's really involved. So it's not anything like your vision of a greenhouse or a farm. So it's worth considering that.
Right. And Marvin, again, like Don, I don't want to speak for the council, but I do think partly this is an attempt to clarify, is there another option other than contract zone? And I think that's it's always a fair question for the council to make sure that they have as much information to make an informed decision. So
And to get ahead of it before
Right,
it
and
becomes
that's our,
a continuing.
Right.
That's
Right.
our role, is to look ahead.
Yeah.
With the advice of the
So-
council to look ahead, is there a future issue here?
Right,
No.
it's their due diligence
Yeah.
to say, all right, we looked at this, we saw this discussion, but
Well,
they may
and
indeed say.
If there were 5 people asking for a contract zone, I would say, well, that certainly recognizes an issue. With one, I'm just offering that.
So contract zones need help too. So if the town, if the farm is successful in stating how and why they need to do this to carry on their farm in perpetuity with council, we've given council some performance standards that they can include in the contract zone. Okay, so if other ones come forward, council has run this through. And worst case scenario, if a contract zone amendment doesn't go through, we've memorialized some performance standards, which is put a pin in this work so that when we come back to this, when we get to the 5 requests, it's done.
The other thing
And I would just like to ask to the chair to give everyone an opportunity to have a final thought on this, and then let's wrap it up and go to stormwater. And in general, I think it would be a good idea for everyone to be able to offer a final thought when we close the books and move on to other things.
Any final thoughts? Anybody want to speak?
I'll give one, first of all, I think I'm in agreement with you on this one, and because the other thing that I take comfort on is that, you know, John and Jean Marie take their role as liaison on this very seriously. And I don't doubt that they're gonna bring back to the full council the quality and tenor of the conversation, and including the quality and tenor of a number of us having voiced the fact that maybe contract zone is good enough. So I'm sure that will be part of their deliberations. I'm sure that will incorporate that in. I agree with Marvin. I think that the one person inspiring the conversation is a little odd, but we've been given a task. Here, we've done it, and I'm ready for the town to listen to us and say what they're going to say.
Okay. And I will say something just because of my past experience on the planning board. One thing that I hated to come in front of us was contract zones. They actually, you know, in essence, whatever comes to us on the planning board during a contract zone process, at least in my experience, didn't matter. Because the council made all the decisions and they could do anything they wanted in terms of ordinances or what they would allow and what they don't. So to me, to have the council make a request to us for our opinion, I think is huge. That they want to hear what we have to say and how we potentially would frame something that we would think would be more acceptable to townspeople than just the council, who may not have the same experience that this board or the planning board would have.
The authority, the definition of the authority for the council on the contract zones is we can make the decision based on any reason or no reason at all.
Yeah.
Well, it's about as broad as it gets.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking that's awesome. We can do whatever we want, but that's the good news. The bad news is, yeah, you can do anything you want, and where do you start?
Well, the thing with being on the council is personal opinion matters. Okay? When you're on the planning board, personal opinion has to be thrown totally out of the room. It's all about what does the ordinance say and does it meet or does it not? So it takes that personal impact out of the decision process, much like an ordinance would do as well. Otherwise, then it does in fact go to the ZBA. So to me, this process right here, I say to the council, thank you very much for taking the opportunity to try to get our opinion where we deal with ordinances on a regular basis. It was greatly appreciated, so.
Thanks, Al. Rachel, any closing?
Yeah,
thoughts?
I was gonna piggyback on the last comment, and that is the planning board gets the fallout. We get the people in front of us who are saying, why did you do this? And what is this? Why are you applying this standard and everything else? And the more we can point to the standard and the clarity. The planning board is defined as a quasi judicial body. And our role is to judge whether an application before us meets standards. And if we have fuzzy standards, then we're searching. That's when personal opinion comes into it. I like this, I don't like this. So this sort of clarity that we work through here, whether it comes to us as a contract zone with stipulations from the council, or it goes into an ordinance, I feel comfortable with this. It's something that we can work with and we can apply standards fairly.
Yeah, to reiterate, I think getting ahead of it before it becomes an issue so that we are in fact handling the next 4 or 5 or 10 consistently is important. And because there's so many things that come into play that we can't necessarily anticipate, but at least here we begin to have a framework that says, okay, if you're going to do this kind of work, this is maybe how it needs to work, and it can be modified in the future.
Not really. I mean, I have no personal opinion on whether we should have marijuana facilities. I think we've developed language that properly addresses it if the council chooses to permit the use, so. I think we're
Dave,
done.
may I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Our comment is in relationship to the council's request for resolving these issues through a contract zone or through
No,
the
it's through
ordinance,
Alternate.
either one.
I think they came back to us and said, we've had this request and a contract zone for this use at this property. And I assume somebody on the council said, maybe we ought to consider having
Right.
this
Options.
as a special exception use. Please help us develop language that will work to make it a special exception with conditions as an alternative to a contract. So I guess that's what I understood. It's been so long since this got to us. I don't remember how it was framed, but that's my understanding.
That's my understanding too.
And so we've developed language. It'll go back to does it go to the ordinance committee first or does it go to the council?
I think it's going back to the ordinance committee.
comes to ordinance section.
Yeah.
And then ultimately to the council, and there'll be public hearing and people will voice their opinions and
From the beginning.
council may or may not choose to make this change, which will then kick it back to the possibility of a contract zone
Thank you. I
or
agree.
nothing, I suppose.
In my closing, my only comment is it always starts with one, and I think my history is accurate, we always address a single issue, a single request. That's been our history. So there's always a single request that comes forward. And then there could be, or there might not be any more requests coming forward, but we're getting ahead of the curve here in terms of trying to address the issue. Let's wrap this up and move on to Angela, who's been sitting patiently waiting for us.
It's not that we don't want to go to school.
Yeah.
Can't wait.
So, yeah, item number 3 is the discussion of stormwater management ordinance. Continuation of our last meeting with Angela.
Yeah. Thank you. I was gonna, obviously I went through my whole presentation last meeting, so I am definitely not proposing to do that again. What I was hoping to do is to get to the last few slides, which unfortunately. Not able to get off of.
It's a pretty picture though.
what I'm
Yeah, we don't mind looking at
It's nice.
that.
Okay. I was trying to unshare. I was just gonna go to basically my final slides, and that's what I was trying to pull up. Which really look ahead, and I guess that's what this group really would be looking at. I'll ignore that for a while. So basically what I ended last meeting, well, I guess as a recap, I went through basically the town, because we are one of the kind of urbanized areas in the state. There are 30 entities, municipalities that are governed by a EPA stormwater permit. DEP regulates that for the state municipalities, so that's who we typically deal with, but EPA is always has the oversight. So with that, we have a new permit, which is a 5-year permit, which is coming online for July 1st of 2022, so this year, just around the corner here. And I started walking through some of those new requirements in that 5-year permit. There were a few ordinance updates that are needed as part of that. And it is a mandate by the state and federal government to incorporate erosion and sediment control ordinance, a low impact development ordinance, and a stream buffer ordinance or overlay associated with our urban impaired streams. Those are 3 significant things that are all tied around stormwater. So when I had this conversation with Jay Chase, we started this conversation saying we already have in our ordinance other pieces that are required by our federal permit. does it make sense to start kind of wrapping those into an umbrella, under an umbrella of one stormwater ordinance? I think I have taken advantage, I will say, being here in Scarborough as a town engineer, with some of the vague language in our ordinance surrounding stormwater. I think we try to do a good job of being consistent, and that's always my number one thing when I sit down with developers early and we talk about, here's how we interpret this vague language and what we would be looking for, and I can point to a dozen other sites where I've required the same exact thing. So that's always been on my mind and making sure that's clear. But it's more about some general language about not impacting downstream abutters and not increasing any pollutants to our waterways, our wetlands, things like that, which I think right now has worked for the town of Scarborough in doing a lot of protection of our natural resources. However, I think we're at a point where it might make sense to start kind of memorializing what the planning board has done. I think this planning board has been very supportive since I've been here of that consistency and saying, this is how we interpret it, and we kind of move forward through those stormwater elements. But it would also, to your point earlier, helpful to have, here's why, this is what we're looking for specifically. There is a number. This is what you must hit, those type of things. So I think there's going to be some give and take a little bit. It's going to be, I'm going to need this group probably to weigh in primarily on what is that threshold. So I can give examples throughout town of sites and where, again, the planning board has been consistent on how much impervious area we're treating, right? When you're below the state stormwater thresholds, we do a lot locally of maximum extent practical comes into play. If a site is all draining to one spot, I might say, have you guys looked at putting a stormwater BMP in that site? In that point, that low point where your site's already draining there, you're not regrading the entire site, you're taking advantage of the elements on your site. So we look at that and saying, take advantage of those type of things. I have a feeling some of those might, if we set a threshold, we might lose some of those smaller sites, but I think in the greater scheme of things, we might capture more as well. So there's going to be a balancing act. Trying to find that line, I think it's going to be important, and it's going to be something that staff's going to need help trying to figure out. And that's where I think you guys come in with that. And like I said, I know there's probably some background that I'll have to provide you in looking at a lot of sites around town and saying, here's what we did here and here's what we did there. And just to give you a frame of mind, the stormwater permit triggering threshold for DEP for a site is 1 acre of impervious area. So anything below that, if we don't have anything in place, it gets lost, and then you get death by 1,000 cuts. I am continuously hearing on a daily basis from residents talking about not only just one development upstream of them, but a lot of development upstream of them. And so when they're hitting some thresholds, say in front of the planning board, all this development, over time, the volume increases. So yes, over 10, 20 years, residents are seeing more flow coming at them. And it's those type of things is because we're not necessarily capturing like those smaller developments, right? So that's where trying to figure out what makes sense, what's too small to worry about or cost for, say, a property owner to endure those type of things, but then also capturing enough so that you're not impacting the residents that are already there and downstream of these sites.
Angela, as we work through this together, are you able to bring us examples from throughout town? I'm thinking of my planning board days out by Scarborough Gallery as that portion of town was sequentially covered by more and more impervious area, we had more and more residents come to us saying, we never used to have to pump our basement, or never had to use my sump pump, and now my sump pump at work is going all the time because of the drainage that's been sort of pushed to their properties. So are you, without impunity, sort of able to bring sort of examples like that to us so that we can work through them to see exactly what you're talking about, so that we can have the ability to maybe lower that trigger in town from 1 acre to some other reasonable number?
Yeah, I think we can probably get some sort of positive examples. I think there's a lot more awareness out there now, probably pushed by Angela, from developers that they have to pay attention, because they know if they come before us and their post-development stormwater is not absolutely lower than the pre-development, we're gonna say, add a couple more things, you know, whatever it is. And recently, we've seen some real attempt to, in redevelopment areas, reduce the impervious surfaces. So for instance, at Martin's, what is it, Starbucks and other building that's gonna go in the parking lot actually reduces what's there. And we've really held buildings coming up to a fair amount of impervious area. So we're seeing a pattern of understanding and concern, but we really also need some standards and some help with that.
Well, it takes it away from more of a personal decision and codifies it. It says, here are, so we're consistent, and it's not you all holding the bag. It's, you know, the
Yeah,
concerns.
and we had a very good discussion at the last planning board meeting with an applicant for Cliffs.
I was just thinking the same site,
yeah.
it's a perfect example.
That's
Yeah.
going to be, Cliffs is gonna be torn down, there's gonna be a building put in there. And the applicant worked very carefully with Angela, and ultimately with the planning board, explaining to us, you know, exactly what their thinking was in terms of the impervious area. And there's going to be less impervious area there than there is now, at the same time as there's going to be parking for 32 cars and a 5,500 square foot building with a cafe and retail. So it was very carefully done with an applicant that understood where the town was coming from in terms of concern about shoreline protection and resource overlay district. So there's some positive stuff now that I came into the tail end of the gallery development, and I think there's been a change, a recognition that nothing exists in isolation, that the action here affects people here. And that sort of whole systems look is extremely helpful, and certainly in stormwater, very needed. So that we don't just look at this development, and this development. We look at the whole impact. We
It's like
look at the
traffic.
whole town.
It's like traffic.
Which planning board does have, that's a good example too, to correlate that, Portia. DOT for traffic, their traffic movement permit is 100 trips. The planning board standard is if you're doing 35 trips, we require some sort of traffic analysis. So that's a good example of, this is the state threshold, but the town of Scarborough asks for, this is, I don't know how that got set at 35. It must have been a conversation like this. So that's where we're trying to figure out, okay, that's where we set it for traffic. Where do we set that for stormwater? And I also wanted to piggyback on the Cliff site is an example of, I guess, another type of development is redevelopment, which we also will want to talk about standards around that, because that's an opportunity to take sites that have zero stormwater treatment and provide some, which Cliffs, that site, the applicant is actually providing water quality treatment as well. And at the time that they're ripping the entire site up, it's lower cost to do it at that time, right? So you're putting in some, and they are choosing some probably lower cost measures, but it's a huge difference from where we are today. That site is going to continue to sit there and have zero treatment. And now we're saying, okay, they're supplying these measures to actually treat the stormwater coming off the site. Huge difference. And like I said, now's the time to do it where it's lower cost. So that's going to be another kind of whole threshold that we'll start talking about. And I know DEP has their own standards also for redevelopment, which gets into like 50% of the site, things like that. So I've been trying to be consistent with that right now because we don't have any alternative. So when we talked, like Volvo is another example that came in and redeveloped their site. And so we tried to kind of hold them to treating some of the site that they're ripping off pavement and putting pavement down, but is there an opportunity to do something with some treatment? Because some of these sites have been sitting there for so long, and at the time that they were originally built, and no fault of their own, there was no standard and there was no reason at the time or understanding that they should be doing that to kind of help the greater good kind of with our water quality.
What it's saying to me is we need, and I don't know if this has ever been done, but we need to look at a broader swath, almost the water, I don't know if watershed's the right word for it, but everything that is impacted in surrounding properties, not only the property, the identified property, but what there is for impervious areas on adjacent and upstream properties that are contributing to that lot.
Yep.
And I don't know if that's even legal. I mean, if there's a way to do that without, I see impacts from other properties impacting how somebody addresses their stormwater system, and that not being very, very amenable to some developers.
The one thing that comes to mind, and yes, this goes back to my planning board days, but the big concern that we've had, and the reason why we've had impact fees and stuff of that nature, is that we never wanted to get to a situation where one particular change, development, whatever the case might be, or the burden of the entire fix. All right. And so it concerns me a little that we could potentially get into a situation here with a stormwater impact that ultimately gets stuck with the fix for everything that's happening upstream. So somehow we need to be sensitive of that issue as well. During the process, I think the one thing that we can kind of rely on, and what I heard you say earlier, and I liked a lot, was that the impact that currently exists on a given site needs to be reduced by, pick a number, X% when the project is done. So that way the burden doesn't fall on any one given site to fix an entire problem. And one of the examples I can quote was where Enclave is now. All right, the stormwater effect downstream at the condo development was unbelievable. And there was, a lot of flooding in that area. And so there was a lot of concern when that went in, what the impact of that was. And they literally designed a system that would reduce the stormwater flow from a surge. And that it wouldn't allow it would allow the stormwater to drain, but it went into a retention area and then it was metered out so that the drainage was over time, which actually reduced the impact downstream more so than what currently had. So I think as we look at these, we just need to be able to keep that in mind and not end up with the burden being all on one person.
Rachel?
Yeah, let me say a couple of things. The Enclave, I came in when the building next to it, the office building that was going to be built. And we heard from the condo association folks. And we worked extensively with the developer, much to his chagrin, I think, to increase the buffering, decrease the parking. And I suspect they ended up getting a little less rent than they thought they were gonna get. I have no idea, but the, basically, when we were done, there was less water flowing off of that area into
Right.
the condo than there was before. But it didn't cure the whole thing.
Right.
But we could make sure that it was mitigated. And I do think that what Angela said about redevelopment becomes very important. It's not that the redeveloped site is responsible for everything. It's that the redeveloped site now has an opportunity to mitigate some issues that happened when it was first developed.
Right.
If you're going to, like with Cliffs, where there was probably nothing there in terms of stormwater mitigation. So what that means is each time we're looking at a site, we're creating incrementally a change all the way down. Not that the last person in gets to put in the traffic light,
Right.
but that everybody has some responsibility, whatever is chosen to define that responsibility, some responsibility to the whole town for some mitigation.
Right.
For some attention, so.
If we're lucky, we get to look at a given site around town about once every 50 to 60 years. When you think about it, because it takes that long for something new to either happen to that location. So you gotta hit it when you have a chance.
Yes.
But if you have the rules that are clear, someone who's looking at redeveloping that property or coming in and developing says, oh, I have to consider this as part of my cost
Right.
of doing this.
Yeah.
Angela, are we talking about working on a new stormwater ordinance? Because I'm not having any success finding the stormwater management ordinance that's referenced in it. Does it exist?
So I guess that's where I was asked to come here to just kind of lay out, I guess, some of the ordinances that are coming at us that are required. So we could easily just put in our low impact development ordinance as a standalone, our erosion sediment control as a standalone, the stream buffers as a standalone. What Jay was asking for me to come is kind of get feedback from this group. Does it make sense to put, and we also already have a post-construction ordinance for stormwater that's its own standalone, chapter 419. Does that chapter 419 say become the stormwater ordinance, and under it are all of these pieces, or we can do this separately? That the issue, like I had pointed out originally, was that we have vague language sprinkled throughout site plan ordinance and subdivision ordinances that I have to still, I've been here 6 years and I'm still, I hunt for it when I have a conversation with somebody and say, oh, well, here's what I'm pulling out, because I like to say, this is what the ordinance says, and we kind of talk through that, right? So that's what I'm currently doing. And like I said, it's working. I think I'm capturing a lot and I think we are protecting. The planning board's doing a good job at kind of listening to staff and saying and weighing that when we talk about resource protection. But so that is the thought. I guess I'm looking for feedback to say, is it time for us to kind of do a stormwater ordinance? And I know Saco just revamped theirs a few years ago and created their own kind of the stormwater, which then site plan and subdivision ordinance refers back to one point. So we'd have to change those ordinances to get, to kind of just reference back to this other ordinance. So that's a lot of work.
Yeah, it is a lot of work, but I think there's some value in having
Yeah.
one place to look in the ordinance to deal with stormwater. It's like the sign regulations. Most of the districts say, as to signs, look at the sign
Yes.
regulation ordinance.
It's
And you
similar
have
to
one
that.
place. I mean, our ordinance is now almost 600 pages long. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And so I would suggest a new freestanding, one location, stormwater management ordinance might be the way to go. It's
And
a lot of work.
by doing that, you would be really implementing some of the things in the comprehensive plan, some of it which talks about stormwater management, but others that talk about simplification of the ordinance system.
Indeed.
So you don't feel like if you focus on this, that you're not accomplishing the work of the comprehensive plan, because you would be.
I think that's a really important point, Karen, because there were so many sort of ideas in there related to like low impact development, maybe that Angela could capture that have already been put in the comp plan. I have a couple of questions for you, Angela, because I think most of us here are thinking large development as far as like a developer is concerned, but working in the stormwater sort of field for the number of years that I did before turning developer for the city. I know that some of the burden also relies on single family homes. So as Alan said, you know, you don't want the last person in to have to pay for the traffic light or the stormwater pond or whatever. So, you know, I think we need to think about how does this affect single family homes? I know that, you know, there are less of those in Scarborough than maybe like a Wyndham or a Gorham type of thing. That's just, but anyway, long story short, can you pull out those items from stormwater, from the ordinance that you've sort of been relying on so that we can use that as maybe a starting point, Angela, for both site plan development, you know, ranging from commercial development down to single family homes. Likewise, Karen, it would be great if we could have from the comp plan sort of what are the goals that we'd like to achieve. And I think it does make sense to sort of codify this or sort of put it into some type of omnibus stormwater consideration. I'm not saying ordinance or whatever, maybe some of them are performance standards. And my last, I guess, where I'll leave this to is part of the planning board, as Alan mentioned, is, you know, your personal opinions can't come into the planning board. And part of the issue that I had on the planning board is not that you see what Angela missed, that you see what DEP missed. You see what Army Corps of Engineers has missed. And we need to empower Angela to be able to rectify those types of things. Because as a planning board member, that was infuriating.
And really to codify it so that whoever, whether it's Angela or
Yeah.
whoever, so that there are clear guidelines.
Mhm.
Because it's one thing to come in with, you know, historical background and relationship with the planning board, and it's another, you know, whoever comes in as a replacement for Jay, who has no historical
Context.
reference, and then boom, gets hit with all of this. Where can you go? And how simple is it to figure out?
One other, maybe this is kind of a wild thought, but we kind of mentioned traffic at the same time, right? Talking about how this all works. Would it make sense to, like we do with traffic, have an impact fee on stormwater? So that we start to build a pool, right? To take care of a problem that's going to exist down the road as we continue to develop our town. And to try to help the situation at some point, like we would traffic.
There are a couple models for that, Alan, and I think what's important is that we start cultivating the projects that stormwater fee is going to fund. Do you know what I mean? So-
Yeah.
So there's
You
this
mean,
thing
yeah.
that you can develop for each watershed called a compensation fee utilization plan. So that when people don't have enough real estate to basically put in their pond or detention pond, they pay an inland fee to the state or whatever.
Yeah.
We need to establish that same thing on a municipal wide basis that says, hey, we have a place where this money is gonna go. So I think we should definitely take up that idea, but also give the ammunition of where's this money gonna go when we have,
What's the
pushback
list
from
of
developers.
projects?
Right.
Yeah,
That
we
we
have,
need
you
to
have to
resolve.
have
We
that.
do
Look
have
at-
one of those plans for Red Brook, but it's essentially tied to wetland fill. And that's a whole nother topic that, that probably should be eventually incorporated. I feel like it's the magnitude of this stormwater ordinance is gonna be so huge that we're not gonna hit it all at once. It's gonna have to be pieces, especially in the fact that my erosion sediment control ordinance needs to be in place a year from today, or it's June of next year. So we're not gonna get everything, but if we could get the structure set up and we start plugging these in, I think it's gonna be, to your point, is we're gonna build, and how you get to something like that. Like I said, for Red Brook, it's laid out of, here are the projects. As we collect money, these are the projects we'll be doing. And DEP requires that. So I'm collecting money. Mostly my money comes in from South Portland because we don't really have a lot of new development in Red Brook. In the Scarborough, on our side of the line, which is actually pretty good. So I'm actually just receiving checks. Because they do have.
Extend that.
They do have actually a lot of development, like the John Roberts Road, all of that residential apartment buildings, they paid to the town of Scarborough. The Muzzy Road, if you get up near the spur, that's in the South Portland side of the line on Muzzy Road, they all wrote checks to the town of Scarborough so that we can work towards a project. Unfortunately, that's connected just to wetland fill. So, so maybe there's another way to capture, like you were saying, if, about water quality treatment, and somehow you'd have to quantify that though, to come up with, which DEP does have a calculation for wetlands. That's why it's very clear, and every developer knows what they're getting into when they fill a wetland. They're paying per square foot. So it's very clear, and they can calculate that before they even look at a property. So, sorry to interrupt, I know.
Peter had his hand up.
Yeah, a few things. First off, I think in terms of the ordinance, I'm still kind of at a loss. Are we going to have a single stormwater management ordinance, which will include elements of the erosion and settlement control ordinance and the low impact development ordinance? Are we going to add a erosion and settlement control ordinance and an LID in addition to our stormwater ordinance, in addition to everything? So I'm just worried about the number of ordinances exploding. And is there a way that we can consider to make the engineer's job easier, but also to make developers and homeowners' jobs easier, of knowing where to go for guidance? Because if we say, well, go to the stormwater management ordinance and the following 8 ones, other ordinances, you're going to terrify people. And I bring this up partially, I love the zoning board. Ultimately, it's interesting, the zoning board gets those single family requests. When somebody wants to put an addition on, or when somebody is putting a garage in and putting a bunch of impermeable surface on to get into the garage, that comes to the zoning board traditionally. And we ask questions about drainage, we ask questions about stormwater and things like that, but we would love to have a quantified set of standards to say, yeah, exactly. And that would also inform abutters when they come to us and say, hey, this guy's house is always flooding my lot. Well, we could ask them to demonstrate it, or we could provide standards to that homeowner who's looking to make an addition. Well, you can make the addition with the following enhancements in order to address the stormwater problem. So yeah, I think that ordinance optimization, or that ordinance kind of crafting, so that it's usable in an easy place, there's an easy guide to it, that will then allow the single family homeowners who will encounter this when they hit the zoning board to also have a good guide.
And to that point too, Peter, I think it's really important that we do fill it all under one stormwater management ordinance, so that developers start understanding that stormwater is erosion sedimentation control. It's low impact development.
I agree.
It's buffers, it's all of these things. So I'm 1000% behind you.
Sounds like a lofty objective effective.
It is, but-
Worthwhile, but does
Yeah.
Angela have the horsepower?
Well, I guess that's where
Yeah.
I'm looking at, maybe we start looking at Karen's help, maybe start looking at the structure of this, to your point now, hearing this feedback, I think we could start with that and saying, here's the elements we're seeing that could be incorporated under, and I'm talking broad brush, right? We're talking about the elements that everyone just listed. Here are the components that might be under the stormwater ordinance. And then as we come through, I'm gonna be hitting deadlines. So my first priority, which might not be this board's or this committee's, but it's gonna be erosion and sediment control ordinance, which is, I think, a low hanging fruit. It's probably the easiest one I'm going to probably get through. So it's maybe a good test as we kind of start doing a structure, but then also be able to plug this in under it and saying, okay, that's how that worked. Now we're going to the next year, we'll have to put in the low impact development, which I think is going to be a more lofty goal. And so that could see that happening, not all at once, I guess, as far as you're talking about the horsepower we would need is kind of kicking away at this and hitting the deadlines that we need to, that over, say, the next 4 years, it might take 3-4 years, then we have a complete stormwater ordinance. And we can also see what goes wrong. I mean, with any ordinance, you kind of have to kick the tires, and that would give the planning board an opportunity and say, okay, we'll see that, I'll see that on that planning board to say, oh, didn't anticipate this loophole that everyone's kind of funneling through, or the opposite is, this is so restrictive, this would be a good project, but it's just hitting a wall because of our language. That would be back in front of opening up the ordinance to keep tweaking it as I'm adding the next ordinance, you know what I mean? It gives us an opportunity where we're already opening it up maybe to get to some of those pieces, because I don't think we're gonna hit a ballpark the first
Right.
shot.
That's a good approach too, so that we don't overwhelm the development community or the family housing, sort of community. And in the stormwater world, sort of what you just talked about, kicking the tires, is adaptive management. Let's put it in place. Let's see if it works. Let's get feedback from the community. Let's not do this in a bubble. Let's get community, feedback on how it's going. But I think we do need to have some type of resolve or something, the support of council to support this, Angela. I think moving forward, that's a resolve would be important.
What would be the process? Would you establish the ordinance and then flesh it out? Or do you, I'm trying to understand the process of putting together one stormwater management ordinance and how that would happen. So with the erosion sediment control, you begin with the stormwater management ordinance and you just start putting pieces into that.
I think, well,
I was just gonna say, it's relevant to the comprehensive plan discussion. For those of you who were on the long range planning committee way back, as this committee in its various iterations worked through the comprehensive plan, it was very methodical, reach out to the community, get some feedback, and even reach out again. So that's gonna be part of our DNA, I think, for the next several years, is scheduling, how do we reach out to the community and get input back.
We're at 9:29, but I'm sure people have to go here shortly, so I think we should wrap up. Is there any closing comments on stormwater?
Yeah.
Go ahead, yep.
There's obviously a lot of knowledge around the table about the issue. I think of Rachel as stormwater management personified. I've seen enough in a sense, planning board meetings, and you're standing at the gates and managing it, and you make a very good case for the help you need, Angela, because of the deadlines coming. I agree with the idea of a comprehensive ordinance being the goal, and listening and having next to no experience comparable to what's around the table. I hear the specific cases and they help understand the larger issue. issues. They probably, in a certain way, boots on the ground define the larger issues for those who know things. However, for those who don't, by definition, they don't define the larger issues. They're the small issues. And what I hear you saying is we need a comprehensive understanding of I mean, traffic is one thing, water is another thing. It finds its own level. And it doesn't bend to our will. And therefore, what I would like to see from you, Angela, is an outline of the whole. I understand you have a timetable, and obviously on that outline, we would be approaching what needs to happen. But the outline of the whole, please.
I think that's something Angela and I can work on
That's good feedback.
and pull in the other aspects of the comprehensive plan and how that fits in.
With ordinance, yeah, globally.
I think you ought to put it on the top of the list of the new planners to do list. Person is hired.
Yeah.
Be
Yeah,
good
there are a lot of
Gonna have a
projects.
lot
Be a
of-
good
mostly-
project for that person to get familiar with.
That's true, you don't have to, because, yeah, my thought, I guess back to Court's comment was, like, how do you start this, if we're gonna do it in little pieces? My thought is, with the ordinance committee, obviously, is after this, we'd be kind of showing that structure, but then also really just pulling out, here are the pieces of stormwater now, so you pull those out of site plan and subdivision, which you will find, and I guess that was one on my to-do list also that Robin mentioned, where are the pieces that you're pulling from? To put that in as kind of the premise of this is the stormwater management ordinance, which I think you guys will find is extremely vague or outdated, because there's a lot of language in there that says that we're gonna completely focus on porous pavement and that's the end all be all, which there are so many other options. So those type of things I'm gonna be pulling out and then putting that in here. So it's just moving it and then adding our pieces, but then to that point, we'll eventually have to get to the meat of it.
So what would our next step be with you?
It sounds like, I think the outline is a good
Yeah.
starting spot for, and then I will also be pulling out the pieces. You can see what we actually have for standards for stormwater.
So you'll
Those are
come
the
back,
two
we'll
action items for me.
get back at a future meeting
Yeah.
to review.
Right,
where
Angela will
we're-
help.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and I might suggest that, I think I reached out to Dave trying to figure out, what's the outline of what this committee is gonna be doing for the next few months while we're waiting for a new planner, and so we're really coming back to the comprehensive plan and your priorities.
Yeah.
So I think Dave and I will work through and maybe have a proposal for you next time. But that begs the issue of future meetings.
Next time.
Yeah.
Well, public comment or, do we have anybody, I mean, we've already reached out to Allison, but is there anybody else out there that wants to? No,
We'll
Okay.
just assume we did that.
okay, so next meeting for the class here, do we want to take the summer? Or do we want to?
So last year you guys took July off, partly it's because your meeting falls at, when everybody's on vacation for, the 4th of July. So if that's your pleasure, I think that works. It gives us a little bit more time to figure out when the new planner is coming online. But it does seem like there's a lot of work and I would suggest that you meet in August.
Yeah.
Take July off, but meet in August.
August 5th.
I'm gonna be bold enough to say that I would be willing to come in July and to see the draft outline and to push this forward, because I think Angela said September is when she had to have her erosion sedimentation. control
No,
plan.
it's a year, it's
Okay,
June
by
of twenty
June of
twenty-three.
2023.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's up to the staff. If the staff would like to take July off, fine, but I'm proposing that we have a July meeting.
Do we do a later in July, do what, 6 weeks between as opposed to 4 weeks between?
That's a good idea. That's a good happy medium.
Why don't we schedule a meeting? No, it's canceled. Easier to
Yeah.
cancel. than
It's easier to
not.
have it on your calendar.
And Jay gave us a great outline of what we need to do with the comprehensive plan. I mean, we're
Yeah.
right in the middle of picking our poison on that. There's lots of work to do.
I propose July 22nd.
What?
Friday, July
Friday.
22nd at 8 AM.
Not before that.
No,
before that.
Works for me.
All I would ask is that it would be a Zoom / in-person meeting.
Or at your camp?
Anybody who wants to come up is welcome.
You better be careful.
Yeah, exactly.
Where is it? Could you have to give the address?
Yeah, we'll be sending out an email.
It's a bit of a ride.
July 22 works for me.
80 miles a day.
I agree, though. I think this is a big project, and to your point, you've got a deadline of June next year. If you start backing up from ordinance committee and readings in the council, it's like, we probably need to get it done by September.
Last month.
Exactly, yeah. So I'm all on board.
Mr. Chair, with the comprehensive plan work that Jay left us, I would feel more comfortable in July returning to that. I feel as though we left that. and
Yeah,
it's
well,
sort
we
of
have to,
dangling
that's
there.
part of, the planning
Even-
process, prioritizing where we go along with our regular business.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, so I've provided Dave with the original priorities, and we were gonna come up with, hey, when are we gonna do each of the priority items? And I think we have to balance, both stormwater, which is part of the comprehensive plan. So you're still achieving your goal, but go back to some of the top priority issues too, and sort of move things ahead.
We're still prioritizing our
Yep.
top priority issues, and before we even jump in, I mean, this is,
Yeah.
my opinion, we sort of just left that hanging.
So that's, we're gonna definitely come back to that and see if we can set the priorities of what we're gonna do over the
Not
next
to
2
belabor
months.
the point, but I think that we are pulling, we've asked to pull stormwater, low impact development, open space, that's all part of stormwater management ordinance. So if it makes you feel any better, Marvin, I think we are tackling some of the bigger issues on the comp plan. And we are without a planner right now too, to lead that charge. So I think this is a happy medium to pull in some of the comp plan work that we can do without a planner.
It
yeah,
affects the marsh. It affects
set his
the
priorities.
Again, I would go back to the larger, going back to the larger picture. I realize we're dealing with important issues within the larger picture. I'd very much like to accomplish that prioritization. I don't think it would take much more than another meeting,
I agree.
actually.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I just want to double check if we're moving to the 22nd for July, are we still on board with a meeting on August 5th?
I'd say yes, partially for exactly the reason that Marvin bringing up. I think we're ready for that second prioritization call, and we'll hopefully be ready for the initiation of this
Right.
stormwater overview as well.
Okay,
Yeah.
awesome.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so July 22nd, August 5th are your next 2 meetings.
You're all listed.
One way or another. Just one technical problem. I noticed the three of us terms are coming. I don't know whether that's fiscal year or a calendar year.
Calendar.
Dave
It's calendar year, I
Yeah.
think.
is the calendar,
Okay.
is Dave,
So-
Allen, and
Okay.
I are
All right, so we'll work with the appointments committee.
but that's calendar year, right? So it's
Pretty sure.
end of December.
Yeah, my appointment.
It's not
as-
campaigning for my.
My appointment as a liaison is at the will of the planning board.
And
When's your planning board term?
Can't remember.
Never.
and I don't know, I don't think we have term limits on, maybe there's term limits for long range planning, but I don't think in general there are term limits on committees.
Are there?
They're not.
No.
I thought there was like a 3.
Alan and I have been on this
That's town
committee
council.
since,
Well, and Dave,
I can't remember when.
Well,
Way back-
we never left it. I
We
guess.
never left. It was like a comprehensive plan
Right.
implementation
Yeah.
committee,
Back in
12,
the
13 years.
Yeah, we just smoothly rolled you into long-range planning.
Appointment for life.
Yes, exactly. There's no leaving.
So we don't have
this.
to worry about July 1.
Fair.
Right.
Can we wrap this up?
Yeah,
I think people do have to get on. Any final comments?
I'll move to adjourn.
Good meeting.
Yeah, thank you.
Second.
Yeah, productive. All in favor?